Hey folks, so we're starting off with our creation myth origin story series here with ex nihilo creation, which comes from the Latin for creation from nothing. So these type of myths typically revolve around like an all-powerful or monotheistic god, or gods which are typically in, one being but in multiple parts, sort of similar to how the Trinity works for Christianity. And these are gods that exist like alone in the universe, or like alone in the void. Sometimes you'll hear that it's in the waters, but the waters is more like the realm of nothingness, right? Just like an empty expanse. And these are actually the most common type of creation myths that we find all over the world. We find them all across like Africa, Asia, Oceania, and the Americas. Two pretty well-known examples of this that we're going to be going into today is Genesis from the Old Testament and the Popol Vuh from the Mayans. The creators in these myths almost always have pieces or echoes of themselves that they place into creation. And normally they are the embodiment of creation itself, not just somebody who created something, but they are the embodiment of creation. Interestingly, the creator is almost always without a mate and just kind of alone in the void. For example, Kiho, the Teotihuacan Polynesian creator, lived alone in the emptiness of Hawaii, or the non-land. His only companion was his double, or like activating self, and this is more like one being in two parts. The entire concept of a creator before there was anything, of course, always leads us to imagine, was there something before the creator, or was the creator created by somebody else? And of course, this is kind of an unanswerable question, but our consciousness, being that it is something of creation, always leads us to want to imagine a pre-existence or a pre-creation, the initial cause. And it's kind of interesting. There's this Rig Veda from India, which is a rather old text, and it talks about, it's kind of questioning creation from nothing, stating that in either non-existence or before existence, could that creator know if or when it happened? Like, did somebody create the Abrahamic God, or is it just kind of always been there? And then for how they create the universe, there's no like strict example, like uniformity between all of this. Some use their voices, their thoughts, saliva, semen, or fecal matter to summon the cosmos. So the first example we're going to go through is the Abrahamic religions, where God was alone in the nothingness and then created the heaven and the earth. And it's well known here that God took 6 days to create and then rested on the seventh. So I'm going to go through each one of these days kind of quickly, and then we're going to move on to the Popol Vuh. So on the first day, there was the earth, and everything was without form in the void. The darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God divided the light from the darkness, creating the light of day, and the darkness he called night. And this was the first day of creation. The second day, he separated the heavens and the earth, and created what was known as the firmament, dividing the waters of the earth with the waters of the heavens. On the third day, God created the plants, the grass, the herbs that yielded seeds, and the fruit trees. On the fourth day, God divided the lights of the heavens from the night, and then he created the seasons, days, and years. And then this is when God created the sun and the moon. The fifth day, God said, let's create all of the animals of the oceans and the birds of the sky. And the final day of creation, God created all the cattle and the beasts that roam the dry land. And finally, he created man in his image to have dominion over not only the earth, but over all of his creations. So the reason I go through all of these days individually is to show another very common motif in creation myths. And that's that even all-powerful gods typically don't just create everything in one fell swoop. There's normally an order, and it's very similar to this, right? God creates the earth, and then the light, and then separates the dry land from the waters, then the plants, then the beasts, or all the animals, and then finally creates man, which is very similar to most other creation stories. So moving on to the Mayans. At the very beginning of the universe, there were two creators, Tepu and Gukamats, who were in the void and in the waters of the cosmos. They sat together in thought, glittering with sun power, and everything they thought came into being. So they worked together, and they thought that the emptiness of the void should become something, and so it did. They said, let there be earth, mountains, and trees, and they came into being, separating the sky and the earth, making the animals. They wanted the animals to praise them, though of course they could not. So the creators spoke again to create the first man, first from mud, earth, or clay. It depends on the translation you read. However, when they got wet, they melted, disintegrated, or fell apart, again depending on the translation. Then they tried from wood. However, they were too inflexible, mindless. They lacked memory and souls. And these wooden men didn't worship them, and they didn't take care of the creations that they had made. So Tepu caused a great flood of resin and rain to destroy these imperfect beings, and the ones that were left were chased out by the other animals into the woods, and they became monkeys. In a hurry, as the dawn of our world was approaching, they enlisted help from the mountain lions, coyotes, parrots, and crows to gather the food, mainly corn or maize, beans, and water, to create the first four men of the four directions: Balam Kitse, Balam Dehab, Makahuta, and Ike Balam. So these were the first four Quiche ancestors. They spoke well, worked hard, they worshipped the creators as they desired. They were very wise and very powerful, but this made the gods a little bit nervous. So they clouded some of their vision and clouded a little bit of their judgment and gave them four wives in order to procreate, making the Quiche and other tribes for the Mayans. So before moving on here, I did want to mention that there's an interesting similarity in Genesis and the Mayan story where God creates man. They're imperfect. They don't worship him properly. They don't respect the creations of God. And then God causes a great flood. So here we had the resin flood to destroy the wooden men. And in Genesis, in chapters 6 through 9, God instructs Noah to create an ark, fill the animals up with them, and then wait out the rain. We see a pretty similar motif, right? Man falls into evil, God creates a flood, and then begins it again. We see this in a few other creation stories, like the Anishinaabe from the Great Lakes region, Kirikahua, the great spirit of the Apaches, who sends a flood because the people have ignored him. Again, this lack of worship and instructions from the gods. The Pomo of California say that the first creation, the first people were so bad that God sent a flood to destroy him. And, later on I'll go into, I'll make a whole video about flood myths specifically, but it's just interesting that we kind of see this over and over and over again. So a couple other quick examples of flood myths, of ex nihilo creations would be Mabombo, the creator of the Bashango people who vomited out all the fundamental elements of the universe. Bagobo of the Philippines say their creator Melu lived in the sky and was very white, and he was constantly polishing his skin in order to maintain its whiteness and its purity. Then he used the dry skin to create all of the earth. Then there's the Fawn people's Mawu, who created the world while riding a rainbow serpent, Edo Huedo, probably pronouncing that wrong, whose movement shaped the mountains and the rivers. Then there's the Bantu-speaking Fang people, who stated in the beginning there was only Nizame, who is God, who is made up of three parts: Nizame, Mabire, and Nukwa, who embody transcendence, immanence, and earthliness, and the rational and feminine aspects respectively. So Nizame created the universe and blew life into it through his self-activating self. Then he enlisted Mabire, who formed the first humans out of clay, and Nukwa, who was responsible for all further acts of creation. And as for how some of these creators came into being, there's a couple quick examples here. So the Abrahamic God has always existed, being beyond birth and death. The Maori creator Io was alone and inactive. To activate himself, he was said to be calling on the darkness to become light, possessing darkness. The Laguna Pueblo thinking woman made thoughts and the names of things, and as she thought of them and named them, they came into existence. So I think that's kind of interesting that a lot of gods have different ways that they came into being as well. So as we've gone through some of these ex nihilo creation myths, from the spoken word of the Abrahamic God shaping life and light over 6 days, the thoughtfulness collaborations of Tepu and Gukamots, crafting humans from maize and the Popol Vuh, and the visceral acts of creation like Bumba vomiting the cosmos, Mawu shaping the world on top of a serpent. There's this interesting thread that's kind of woven throughout all of human history, right? Spanning continents and over the millennia, it reveals this like shared fascination that people have with this ultimate mystery of like, how did everything seem to come from nothing? You know, whether it's like voice or thoughts, essence, self-activation, all of these deities kind of just like they embody all of these different polytheistic religions sort of in like one or two beings. What I find really interesting though is like the universality of a lot of these motifs, like the creators creating everything, realizing it was imperfect, and then creating great floods. And there's parallels here across almost all regions of the earth have very, very similar origin stories. So that's going to be it for today. And if any of you found any of this interesting, make sure to follow along, because we're going to be going through a whole bunch of different origin stories. Each week, I'm going to be dropping a new video about this, going through all the different types of origin stories. And next, we're going into creation from chaos, where some of the fundamental building blocks of the universe already exist, and then God creates everything else from that. So, see you next time.